From the majestic island of Themyscira to the nth metal deposits of Thanagar, I am Dom of X, and this morning we are going to look at the DC Finest Superman, the first superhero, the next installment of DC's comprehensive collected edition line, reprinting stories from 2011 to 1938. Let's go get to it. Up, and away. All right, everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today, again, we are talking about DC Finest Superman, the first superhero, and there are a lot of things I want to say about this book and just Golden Age comics in general, but I don't feel like it would be enough for 20 minutes. 15 to 20 minutes of talking, so I will be doing a separate review for this and every single DC Finest that I get a chance to. It's definitely going to be, I think, a cool retrospective to have on the channel, maybe a review. I know that the views might not be as high, but I figure people would like to see what my full thoughts on all of the stories are. There are a lot of stories in here. Regardless, though, DC Finest Superman, the first superhero, released this week, or I should say the 5th of November. Again, didn't get a chance to fully record everything, but it did come out on the 5th of November along with Batman Year 1 and 2. You can buy this title, again, for $39.99 at your local comic shop or whichever direct market or book retailer you decide to purchase this at. This select collected edition also clocks in at 584 pages. Here's a look at the front. Once again, you have the iconic Action #1 cover by none other than Joe Shuster. Of course, the guy, just wondering why. I've seen that emote so many times, so many different places. And of course, Superman with the original Golden Age look. And again, there is the high lettering font, and then the more expanded font on the bottom with Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster on the bottom. Here's a look at the spine. DC Finest, the first superhero. And in fact, if I can get my Batman DC Finest as well, here is a comparison between both. Get that in focus for you all. Right there, without the glare, you can see the Superman on the right. And you can also notice that the DC logos are a little bit different in size, with the Batman one being bigger. And this is unfortunately going to be the case for a lot of these books, that they'll have the DC logo, the DC Bullet logo, which again is a nice added touch to have every single part of the DC line aligned with their comics singles. So the brand new DC Bullet logo, or the blue facade gradient DC Bullet logo. But it is unfortunate that smaller DC Finest trade paperbacks are going to have smaller DC Finest logos. I think that might be a problem for some people who might have that OCD on the shelf. I definitely will have that OCD, so I might be partly mad at it, but again, it is what it is. And there you see, 1938 to 1940. On the back, we got, again, presenting DC Finest stories, the same blurb that they had on the Batman one. Now, if you look here, you can see that this one is white bolded text with regular font being in yellow, while it is the opposite for Batman. Batman has the yellow text with the white regular font in and of thereof. And I would like to see some variation of this, but again, it is what it is. On the back, you do have the select covers for the book. Again, Marvel does this with some of their older classic omnibuses. DC did the same for Batman Year 1 and Year 2, highlighting certain covers of the collected edition. Action Comics #1, Action Comics #7, Action Comics #20, Action Comics #23, New York World's Fair Comics, Superman #1, Superman #4, and Superman #5. There you can see on the bottom you have the years, specific years highlighted from 1938 to 1940. And of course, for Superman, this will make sense because every single year DC has been in existence, so has a Superman book existed at some point. Even when Superman was not on, I will say, Earth for the Philip Kennedy Johnson run, there were still Superman comics being published. So Superman will always be a mainstay no matter what. I hope. We will have to see, obviously, between that and public domain rights, but it is what it is. Champion of the Oppressed, rocketed to Earth from a doomed planet and given the name Clark Kent by the people who found him. Kal-El of Krypton would discover that his alien heritage granted him extraordinary abilities under Earth's yellow sun. Able to leap 1/8 of a mile, hurdle a 20-story building, raise tremendous weights, and run faster than an express train, Clark decided to use his powers to benefit humanity, and so was created Superman. 1938, legendary creators Siegel and Shuster introduced the world's first modern superhero. Superman's distinctive blue, red, and yellow costume and noble persona would go on to establish the superhero archetype for generations to come, spawning many homages and imitators as well. But the Superman Metropolis wonder will forever be the template of the original comic book hero. So yes, let's go ahead and take a dive right into it. Let's take a look at the inside of what the book has to offer, at least from the beginning. There you see, of course, the Joe Shuster collection art, with Superman created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster with special arrangement by the Siegel family. On the left-hand side, you have all of your copyright information, along with the original editors of the series, Vincent Sullivan, Whitney Ellsworth, along with Murray Boltinoff. Reza Lockman, who I praised for getting all of the mapping in this book, along with Steve Cook, who has done a tremendous job on design work. Mary Javins, of course, the editor-in-chief, and everything else published there. Here's a look at the table of contents on the right. We have every single one of these mapping in order from publication date, which again, I think is a nice touch. And also, they do denote that every single story is by Siegel and by Shuster, unless it's otherwise noticed. For example, for Action Comics number 7, Wayne Boring is the artist for that book, not Joe Shuster, I should say. And they also notice that inkers are different. You have Paul Loretta there. You have Paul Cassidy, who also shows up and guest stars in some of these books. You also have other creators such as Dennis Neville and Wayne Boring on inks also popping up in here. They also, one thing the book I actually do appreciate is that they do denote two things. One, if there is a story that is maybe untitled or where did they come from, they do say that they are titled for reader convenience, which is really nice to see. For example, the Europe at War two-part story. Two-part stories, I think, were pretty loosely here and there in the golden age of comics. You don't see them pop up as much because issues were usually one and dones. We didn't have the long sprawling arcs that we do nowadays with 4 to 7, even sometimes 8, 9 issues spanning one entire arc. Another thing that I really appreciate from DC is that they do denote that because this was published in the 1930s and early 1940s, we as a country were trying to be better. Obviously, World War II played a huge role in the making of this book, along with the Great Depression. And with that, you, of course, have the American treatment towards Japanese Americans, etc., being part of the book. And I think it's impossible to talk about Golden Age Superman without displaying that. And I really appreciate that DC said that these, again, were reprinted at the time when racism was in a larger role of society and popular culture, both consciously and unconsciously. They are presented here without alteration for the historical reference. DC arrives and strives to be as thorough as possible in its effort to determine creators' identities from all available sources. While this process is not perfect, as a result, some attributions may be incomplete or wrongly assigned. So again, I do appreciate that DC at least had the misnomer of that as well. So a couple of select stories overviews. I feel like I need to talk about a little bit of those here before I move on. The first, of course, is Action Comics number 1. A lot of comic books at this time were anthology series. They weren't the, hey, there's a team, there's some drama. It wasn't here's one single character and they're part of every single part of this book. The thing about comics in these days were that they were strict anthologies and you had them structured where other characters were appearing. Zatara popped up in multiple of these Action Comics issues. In fact, he's even on some of the covers that were in the early Action Comics and covers and issues and whatnot. So at this time, Superman had front billing. He had usually 12 to 14 pages of page comic time worth, screen time worth. He usually had top billing. By usually, I do mean he was pretty much on the front every single time of these comic books, with exceptions to some sort. And of course, what I do love about these DC Finest editions is that they do post the cover of all of these. Superman isn't here. So this is something I think that is important to denote at this point in time. One thing I can also say about the Superman DC Finest edition is that they also, along with the table of contents and all the pages at the bottom, which usually isn't a feature of DC collected editions, I really appreciate that they have it here. I love that they included the New York World's Fair comic in here, if only for the fact that we get the full Superman story in here. They won't include the Zatara stuff. They won't include any of the other characters who popped up in this book. Even Butch and the Sandman, who also was in here, who eventually would make his way to the Justice Society of America in due time. So, on top of DC having a really nice reading order for Superman, one thing that I can really appreciate is that they make full strides and efforts to include literally every single thing about Superman in this book. New York World's Fair was, in its own way, this is my experience of it. It was like, hey, this looks familiar. This is like reading Iron Man or watching Iron Man 2, but in a Superman book. Obviously, it's not the same, but the concept of the World's Fair, I think, was pretty similar to the Stark Expo. So that, for me, was a pretty nice treat to see. And it was also a nice, fun Superman Saves Lois story as well. And in fact, Superman would even get so popular to the point where he eventually got his own series. One thing that I really appreciate, and there you can see if there is a page break, they will usually put in art from the series that to fill up the pages if they just don't have anything else of that worth. Superman eventually would get his own mini-series, or his own ongoing, which was pretty unheralded at the time. And by unheralded, I mean in the fact that Supermania was so big that they had to do it. He was so popular, everybody was loving Superman. All the kids were loving Superman. There you can see the Ultra Human Knight in his full glory. And it got to the point where they realized we need to give this character his own book. And so they gave the character their own book, and it ended up being one of DC's greatest hits ever. And also the template, once again, for every single comic book going forward as well. Let's talk about a little bit of spoilers and what was going on here at the time. And again, I'd love to do this in full, but if you want to see that, let me know. I need to figure out what I want to do for the structure of that as well. So this is a different Superman that I think you and I are experiencing. By different Superman, I don't mean in the context of the character. I think the character's ideals have pretty much stayed the same for the most part. Now, we need to talk about broad spoilers. And this is definitely a different Superman setting than we are used to. By different Superman setting, I mean it's not the Metropolis, it's not the New York that you and I imagine every single time when we read or see Superman on the big screen. Superman is labeled here as a champion of the oppressed. I know that truth, justice, and the American way has always been ingrained in Clark, but it wasn't always like that. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were two kids of immigrants, one in Toronto, one in Cleveland, Ohio, who made their way and to figure out about, hey, what if we can create a character that can stand up to domestic violence, then can stand up to bullies, that can stand up to the people who are doing wrong. And that's how they created Superman. It came out from a failed science comic strip back in the mid 1930s. They decided, hey, we created a villain there. What if we instead made a hero? Unrelated, this is one of my favorite stories in the entire Golden Age Superman issues that I've read. Superman issue 2, where Clark saves a man falling from suicide and realizes, hey, this guy committed suicide because his boss is not a great person and almost drugged him. So Superman goes undercover twice to beat up all the other boxers that he's fighting. But anyways, to get back to my point, Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel created this character to mimic something that, yes, when he takes his glasses off, he becomes one of the most unique and strongest characters that there are in the universe. And it got so big that, again, DC decided to, or national publications, I should say at the time, DC, there may be a little bit more PC there on the terminology. They decided we got to get this guy their own book. I need to also talk about some other things besides, of course, Clark Kent and Superman being the forefront of this book. Lois Lane, I don't think, has any right to be as strong as of a character as she was, especially during a time in the late 30s where women just got the right to vote 17 years prior. And it's something cool to see. In the case of she's feisty, she is fierce-tempered. She can definitely stand up for herself, which is, again, it's more than I think a lot of female characters were written and created back during those ages. And for that, and on top of the Archie-like will they, won't they with Clark and then Superman and Lois in sort of a love triangle where Clark's trying to go out with Lois and she's just like, I don't know about that. It's something that actually kept me engaged in some of the back issues or the back parts of the Superman issues that I'm reading. Jimmy Olsen obviously makes his in the 6th issue of Action Comics as this blonde reporter. It's not the Jimmy Olsen that I'm sort of used to seeing. It's a much different Jimmy Olsen that evolved through the years. And whenever we get to Silver Age and Bronze Age and eventually post-Crisis Superman, I'd love to talk about the differences between each of those iterations of these characters. The same goes for Lex Luthor. He's not the Lex Luthor that I'm used to seeing. In fact, I got so mixed up, reading all of this because my brain wants to jump from forget whatever's happening in the panel and in the text boxes, look at what's happening in the text bubbles. It got to the point where I had stuff mixed up, and that I think happened to me often, but that's just because I think I'm a younger person. I know it's probably not going to be the same experience for everybody. It's just that my brain goes in different places because it's not used to reading comics like this. And on top of that, again, not the Lex Luthor that I'm used to seeing. Again, I mixed up Ultra Humanite with him, but a lot of it was different, right? So a lot of this was set in war due to conflicts raging in different parts of the world at this time. And Lex Luthor is this redhead momentarily before he decides to go bald. He's never mentioned by his first full name. We won't get that until a lot later. So he's just known as Luthor. And it wasn't until later that we got to see him as sort of, yes, being Superman's biggest adversary ever. Again, different setting. It's the Daily Star, not the Planet. It's George Taylor who's the editor-in-chief of the Daily Star, not Perry White. In fact, Joe Shuster named the Daily Star after the Toronto Daily Star, which had been the newspaper that his parents received, and Shuster, on top of that, worked for them as a newsboy. And the one thing that I'd like to say last is that, to go on to the final verdict, this is going to take a lot of time to read. I did not find this an easy sit-down read, I think as some others might, but again, that is just because I'm used to reading a lot more modern comics than I do for the older ones. And it's weird too because I'm reading Silver Age Spider-Man and I'm enjoying every single issue and I don't want to stop reading because I think Stan Lee and Jack and I think Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and John Romita Sr. and everybody else who was contributing to that table, comics had evolved up until that point. They were doing something different. Marvel was doing something different. This, I would say, is DC's attempt, or the national publication's attempt, again, I'm sorry, for doing these comic strips in a comic book format. For example, this is something that I think if I was reading in the Sunday newspaper, I don't think I would have minded it as much because they're extended from left to right. This was definitely something different than a lot of people probably might have done in the meantime, which is why I keep hearing from people, read Golden Age news strips, read Golden Age newspaper comics. Don't read the material like this. And you know what I will say to those people? I don't think that there are some people who prefer Post-Crisis Superman over this as a jumping on point, and probably should have been the jumping on point for DC Finest. But the one advantage I can say of this is that this is definitely a historical trinket that everybody should experience at some point, because again, we don't get modern superheroes if we don't have this book. This is not only, again, the template for everything that superheroes would eventually be in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s to today, but it's also something that it's important in the fact that we evolved so much from this type of storytelling, and to see how Joe and Jerry were able to not only piece this together, but to be able to see how not only page to page and issue to issue see what they're doing differently. You can compare this to an issue of Joshua Williams' Superman and see what the tonal differences are, what the goals of each issue are different in, and what each book has to offer that isn't. So in that fact, I can appreciate not only the old source material, but see how new source material for Superman changes in due time in the evolution. Last thing I want to say on the verdict is that you guys should also read this for the Joe Shuster art. Every single panel that Superman is in, he is bulldozing through somebody. He is a gladiator. He can fight it in the ring. And if he's not doing that, he's on a baseball field rigging games. There is so much fun, I think, to be had with some of the concepts of the story. And even in the case of that, there's, I think, something for everybody to enjoy in Superman Golden Age. And even if for that, I think just owning this piece is a nice thing to have. Say, hey, like I have Action Comics #1. Maybe that throws you in on top of all of the Super Health ads, which is great. And having that for prosperity and also for the kids, it's a good thing to see that Superman was a positive influence on society and humanity as a whole. And I hope that we get more Superman stories and out like this. I think it would be pretty cool for them to complete this and eventually get to Man of Steel at some point. But that is going to be it for me. I am Dom of X signing out. If you haven't yet, please like the video and subscribe if you haven't. I would love that. I'm going to be doing Gail Simone's Wonder Woman next on my channel. And there should also be a comic releases update video sometime later this week. Also, comment down below. Let me know, guys, if you are planning to pick this up, why and why not. And let me know down below what you think of Golden Age Superman. That's going to be it for me, though. You be you. Take care. Dominate the day wherever you are.